Ladies and gentlemen, human behavior is a curious paradox, isn't it? We crave connection, yet often we find ourselves unable to reach out, unable to bridge the gap between longing and action. Today, I want to explore this perplexing dynamic. While someone might deeply desire to contact you but never does, desire without action is self-sabotage. At the heart of this dilemma lies a truth we often neglect. Desire, no matter how intense, is meaningless without the courage to act on it. But here's the catch. Fear is the great paralyzer. The fear of rejection, the fear of inadequacy, the fear of hearing the words, "I don't feel the same." These fears can suffocate even the strongest desires. The complexity of human psyche. To understand this better, we must delve into the labyrinth of the human mind. It's not that he doesn't care or doesn't want to, quite the opposite. The intensity of the craving can amplify the hesitation. He stands at the edge of a precipice, yearning for the leap, yet held back by the weight of his inner conflicts, the fear of being truly seen. There's a vulnerability in reaching out. It's not just about saying, "I miss you" or "I want to talk." It's about exposing oneself, risking rejection, and perhaps worse, the possibility that the other person will see the cracks, the flaws, the insecurities that he worked so hard to hide. The role of unconscious patterns. Often, we are prisoners of our past. Maybe he's learned that reaching out leads to pain, or maybe he's been conditioned to associate longing with loss. These unconscious patterns play out like a silent script, dictating behavior in ways even he may not fully comprehend. The shadow of expectation. He may hold an idealized image of what this connection should be, what he should say, how you should respond, how perfect it all must feel. The gap between reality and these expectations can be so daunting that he chooses silence over perceived imperfection. But here's where we arrive at the most critical point, the power of choice and agency. No matter how complex the psychology, no matter how deeply ingrained the fears and patterns, he still has a choice. And so do you. You cannot force someone to bridge the gap between craving and connection, but you can choose how to interpret the silence, how to respond to it, and what to do with your own sense of worth. Because in the end, it's not about waiting for someone to act on their desires. It's about understanding that your value is not diminished by someone else's inability to confront their fears. And sometimes the greatest act of love you can offer is to let them confront their struggles while you focus on your own growth and clarity. Desire without action represents a profound internal conflict that many people experience but rarely articulate. It emerges when the yearning for connection, intimacy, or fulfillment collides with the fears and insecurities that prevent us from taking the necessary steps to achieve what we deeply want. This inner turmoil often begins as a faint hesitation, a flicker of doubt that whispers, "What if I'm not enough? Or what if they don't feel the same?" Over time, this hesitation can solidify into a paralyzing force, trapping individuals in a cycle of longing and inaction. The fear of rejection is one of the most potent barriers to action. Rejection isn't merely about hearing no. It's about the perceived validation of our deepest insecurities. When someone desires a connection but refrains from reaching out, they are often shielding themselves from the possibility of pain. To extend oneself toward another, whether through a message, a gesture, or a declaration of feelings, is to make oneself vulnerable. It is to place a piece of one's identity in the hands of another, hoping it will be met with care and understanding. The uncertainty of how this vulnerability will be received can be overwhelming, leading individuals to retreat into the safety of silence. Compounding this fear is the pervasive sense of inadequacy that many carry. Modern society, with its relentless emphasis on perfection, physical, emotional, and intellectual, feeds this sense of not being good enough. Social media, with its curated images and narratives, exacerbates the issue by creating unrealistic standards for how relationships should look and feel. When someone believes they fall short of these standards, the desire to connect is often eclipsed by the belief that they have nothing valuable to offer. The result is a self-imposed isolation, where longing remains unspoken and unfulfilled. The vulnerability inherent in reaching out is another significant factor. To desire connection is to admit to oneself and others that one has needs, that one is not entirely self-sufficient. For many, this admission feels like a weakness, a flaw in their armor. Society often celebrates independence and stoicism, equating them with strength, while vulnerability is dismissed as a liability. This cultural narrative discourages people from embracing the risk of genuine connection, even when their hearts ache for it. Silence becomes a coping mechanism, a way to manage the discomfort of conflicting emotions. On one hand, there is the deep yearning for closeness, for shared laughter, understanding, and support. On the other, there is the fear of exposure, the fear of being misunderstood, dismissed, or even ridiculed. Rather than confronting these fears, many choose to remain passive, convincing themselves that it's better to live with the possibility of connection than to face the certainty of rejection. This self-protective strategy, however, often backfires as the unspoken desire festers, turning into a source of inner suffering. Over time, this pattern of longing without action can become ingrained, creating a cycle that is difficult to break. The more one avoids acting on their desires, the more daunting the prospect of doing so becomes. The mind becomes adept at justifying inaction, weaving narratives about timing, circumstances, or the other person's perceived disinterest. These justifications serve to protect the individual from immediate discomfort, but often lead to a deeper sense of regret and unfulfilled potential. The result of this paralysis is a kind of silent suffering that is both profound and isolating. The individual feels the weight of their unexpressed desires, a constant reminder of what could be but is not. This suffering is often invisible to others, as those caught in this cycle rarely share their internal struggles. Instead, they carry the burden alone, convinced that no one else can understand their predicament. The silence becomes not just a lack of action, but a wall that separates them from the very connection they crave. The role of unconscious patterns in shaping human behavior, particularly in the realm of relationships and connection, is profound and often underestimated. These patterns, forged through past experiences, become the scripts by which people navigate their interactions with others. They are not chosen consciously, but are instead deeply embedded within the psyche, influencing actions and decisions in ways that often escape notice. Understanding the power and persistence of these patterns requires a closer look at how they form, how they operate, and the impact they have on behavior. At the heart of these unconscious patterns lies the human tendency to seek safety and predictability. The mind is a survival-oriented mechanism constantly striving to avoid pain and discomfort. When a person experiences rejection, neglect, or emotional pain in their formative years or significant relationships, their mind creates strategies to protect them from experiencing similar pain in the future. These strategies often manifest as avoidance, withdrawal, or emotional detachment. Over time, they become automatic responses to situations that even vaguely resemble past hurts. For instance, someone who was repeatedly criticized or dismissed when they expressed their feelings as a child might learn to suppress those feelings entirely. In adulthood, they may crave deep emotional connections, but struggle to express vulnerability. They avoid situations that might expose them to rejection, even if those situations hold the potential for profound connection. These patterns of avoidance, though initially developed as a means of self-preservation, become a barrier to fulfilling the very desires they are trying to protect. What makes these patterns particularly challenging is their operation beneath the surface of awareness. Most people are not consciously aware of the ways their past influences their present behavior. They might rationalize their inaction or avoidance with seemingly logical reasons. It's not the right time, they wouldn't understand, or I don't want to bother them. These justifications mask the underlying emotional drivers: fear, insecurity, or unresolved trauma. The individual remains stuck in a loop, repeating behaviors that perpetuate their isolation and dissatisfaction. These unconscious patterns are also reinforced by the mind's tendency to seek evidence that supports existing beliefs. If someone believes they are unworthy of love or connection, a belief often rooted in past experiences, they are likely to interpret ambiguous situations in ways that confirm this belief. A delayed response to a message, a neutral comment, or even silence can be perceived as rejection. This misinterpretation reinforces the belief, solidifying the pattern and making it even harder to break. Another complicating factor is the societal and cultural influences that often validate these patterns. Messages about self-sufficiency, emotional restraint, and the risk of vulnerability can discourage individuals from examining or challenging their unconscious behaviors. Instead of viewing their avoidance as a problem to address, they may see it as a form of strength or independence. This cultural reinforcement adds another layer of resistance to change. The impact of these unconscious patterns extends beyond the individual to their relationships. When someone operates from a place of avoidance or rejection, they can unintentionally create distance between themselves and others. Their behavior may be misinterpreted as disinterest, coldness, or even hostility, leading to misunderstandings and missed opportunities for connection. This in turn reinforces their belief that connection is unattainable or unsafe, perpetuating the cycle. Breaking free from these patterns requires a willingness to confront the uncomfortable truths that lie beneath the surface. It involves examining past experiences, identifying the beliefs and behaviors they have shaped, and challenging the assumptions that no longer serve a constructive purpose. This process is neither quick nor easy, as unconscious patterns are deeply rooted and often intertwined with one's sense of identity. However, it is a necessary step for those who wish to move beyond the cycles of avoidance and rejection that keep them from the connections they desire. The fear of being truly seen is a paradoxical tension that arises in the pursuit of authentic connection. While many yearn for deep relationships where they feel understood and valued, the vulnerability required to achieve such intimacy can be profoundly unsettling. At its core, this fear stems from the realization that to be truly seen means to expose not only one's strengths and virtues, but also one's flaws, insecurities, and hidden imperfections. The closer one gets to the possibility of genuine connection, the more amplified this fear becomes, creating an internal conflict that can lead to withdrawal or self-sabotage. To be truly seen by another is to step into a space of raw honesty. It means laying down the mask that one often wears to navigate the world. The curated personas designed to project confidence, competence, or desirability. These masks provide a sense of safety, a buffer against judgment and rejection. However, they also act as barriers to genuine intimacy. When the possibility of authentic connection arises, the thought of shedding these protective layers can feel like standing unguarded in a storm, exposed to whatever judgment or rejection might come. This fear is particularly potent because it touches on one of humanity's most deeply rooted anxieties, the fear of inadequacy. Many people carry the belief, whether conscious or unconscious, that if others were to see them fully, they would find them lacking. This belief often stems from past experiences of criticism, rejection, or betrayal, where vulnerability was met with harm rather than acceptance. The memory of those experiences lingers, creating a reluctance to risk being truly open again. As a result, the prospect of authentic connection can trigger a cascade of self-doubt. What if they see who I really am and decide I'm not enough? What if my flaws outweigh my virtues in their eyes? These questions often lead to a kind of emotional retreat where one distances themselves from the very connection they crave. The irony is that this retreat can reinforce feelings of isolation and longing, creating a self-perpetuating cycle of fear and withdrawal. Another aspect of the fear of being truly seen is the unpredictability it entails. Authentic connection is inherently uncertain because it requires surrender and control. One cannot predict or control how another person will respond to their vulnerabilities. This uncertainty can be deeply unsettling, especially for those who have built their lives around the illusion of control. Letting go of this illusion means accepting that rejection or misunderstanding is a possibility, and for many, this risk feels too great to bear. The closer one gets to realizing their desires for connection, the more these fears intensify. The prospect of having what one wants, a relationship where they are loved and understood for who they truly are, brings with it the heightened possibility of losing it. This fear of loss can be paralyzing, causing individuals to retreat before the connection can fully form. It's as if the mind calculates that it's better to remain in longing, where the possibility of connection still exists, than to risk the pain of gaining and then losing it. This dynamic also reveals a profound vulnerability in human nature, the fear that being truly seen might confirm one's deepest insecurities. If someone believes they are unworthy of love, the thought of exposing themselves completely can feel like stepping into a trial where the verdict might affirm their worst fears. This fear is not rooted in reality, but in perception, yet it wields immense power, dictating behavior and shaping relationships. Ultimately, the fear of being truly seen is both a barrier and a doorway. It challenges individuals to confront their own insecurities, to question the narratives they've built around their worth, and to decide whether they are willing to risk vulnerability for the possibility of authentic connection. While the fear itself may never fully disappear, it can be managed and overcome through self-awareness, courage, and the willingness to take the first steps toward openness and trust. The role of unconscious patterns in human behavior, particularly in relationships, operates like an unseen script, dictating responses and decisions without the individual's conscious knowledge. These patterns, often born from past experiences, particularly those involving pain, rejection, or trauma, become entrenched in the psyche over time. They influence how people perceive others, interpret situations, and respond to emotional triggers, perpetuating cycles of avoidance or rejection that they might desperately wish to escape. At the core of unconscious patterns is the mind mind's need for familiarity and safety. Even when a situation is undesirable, if it is familiar, it feels safer than stepping into the unknown. For instance, someone who has faced repeated rejection in formative relationships might unconsciously develop a belief that they are unworthy of love or connection. This belief becomes a lens through which they view the world, coloring their perceptions of themselves and others. They may avoid situations where vulnerability is required, not because they do not desire connection, but because the risk of repeating past pain feels too overwhelming. These patterns often stem from deeply ingrained emotional conditioning. A child who grew up with inconsistent affection or approval might learn to expect emotional instability from relationships. They might unconsciously seek out partners or situations that mirror this instability, reinforcing the belief that love is inherently unpredictable or painful. Similarly, someone who learned early on to suppress their emotions to avoid conflict may carry this habit into adulthood, struggling to express their needs and desires in relationships, which leads to further feelings of disconnection and frustration. What makes unconscious patterns particularly powerful is their stealth. They operate beneath the level of awareness, making it difficult for individuals to recognize and challenge them. Instead, people often rationalize their behavior with explanations that seem logical on the surface, but fail to address the deeper emotional drivers. For example, avoiding a potential relationship might be justified as not being the right time or focusing on personal goals, when in reality, it is fear of rejection or inadequacy at work. The individual may remain unaware of the true reason behind their actions, trapped in a loop of self-justification and avoidance. These patterns are also self-reinforcing. When someone acts out of avoidance, the outcome often validates their underlying beliefs. If they distance themselves from a potential connection and the other person moves on, they may interpret this as proof that they were not valued or wanted in the first place. This misinterpretation strengthens the original pattern, making it even harder to break free in the future. Over time, these cycles become so ingrained that they feel like unchangeable aspects of the individual's personality rather than behaviors that can be understood and transformed. The societal and cultural narrative surrounding relationships can also contribute to the persistence of unconscious patterns. Messages that equate vulnerability with weakness or that glamorize independence at the expense of connection can discourage people from examining the roots of their behaviors. Instead of seeing avoidance as a coping mechanism, it might be framed as a form of strength or self-sufficiency. These narratives can provide a convenient but ultimately unhelpful justification for behavior that stems from unresolved emotional wounds. Breaking free from unconscious patterns requires a deliberate effort to bring them into awareness. This process often begins with self-reflection and a willingness to explore the origins of one's beliefs and behaviors. It involves asking difficult questions. Why do I react this way in certain situations? What am I afraid of? What past experiences might have shaped these patterns? This inquiry can be uncomfortable as it forces individuals to confront aspects of themselves they may have long avoided. However, it is also the first step toward transformation. Once these patterns are identified, the work of change begins. This often involves challenging the beliefs that sustain them, experimenting with new ways of thinking and behaving, and developing a greater capacity for self-compassion. Overcoming unconscious patterns is not about erasing the past, but about reinterpreting it, learning from it, and using that understanding to create healthier, more fulfilling relationships in the present. The process is gradual and requires patience, but it opens the door to breaking free from cycles that no longer serve one's emotional growth or well-being. The shadow of expectations looms heavily over human relationships, shaping desires, behaviors, and often the decisions to engage or withdraw. Expectations, while sometimes motivating, can also become insurmountable obstacles, creating a chasm between what one yearns for and what one believes is possible. Unrealistic expectations, whether they are self-imposed or projected onto others, can lead to paralyzing doubt, self-criticism, and avoidance. These unseen forces can transform the simple act of reaching out into an intricate web of perceived risks and impossible standards. When expectations are turned inward, they often manifest as a relentless pressure to meet certain ideals before pursuing connection. This internal dialogue might sound like, I need to be more successful, attractive, or interesting before anyone would want to be with me. These self-imposed expectations stem from a deep-seated fear of inadequacy, driven by the belief that one's current self is not enough. This belief not only distorts self-perception, but also delays or prevents action as the individual perpetually strives for a version of themselves that feels more worthy of love or acceptance. In this way, the shadow of expectations creates an invisible but impenetrable barrier. It fosters a mindset mindset in which connection is conditional, based on achieving a set of criteria that are often undefined or unattainable. The result is a cycle of waiting to become better, waiting for the perfect moment, waiting for an imagined future where vulnerability feels safer. This cycle keeps individuals locked in isolation as the conditions they set for themselves are rarely, if ever, met. On the other hand, expectations projected onto others can be equally paralyzing. The fear of disappointment, either disappointing another person or being disappointed by them, can deter people from pursuing relationships altogether. For instance, one might idealize a potential partner or imagine a perfect relationship dynamic only to withdraw at the first sign that reality does not match their fantasy. Similarly, the fear that others expect perfection in return can lead to a preemptive retreat, avoiding connection to sidestep the risk of failing to meet those imagined demands. This interplay between internal and external expectations often creates a situation where the stakes of connection feel unbearably high. The mind builds a narrative in which rejection becomes not just a possibility, but a devastating confirmation of inadequacy or failure. The more one craves a relationship, the more heightened these fears become, as the potential rewards seem inseparably tied to equally significant risks. The result is a paralyzing hesitation, where the desire for connection is eclipsed by the fear of falling short. Social and cultural influences exacerbate this dynamic by amplifying the pressure to conform to certain standards in relationships. Media portrayals of romance often emphasize perfection, portraying idealized versions of love that are free from flaws or challenges. These portrayals seep into individual expectations, fostering unrealistic benchmarks for both oneself and others. The comparison to these unattainable ideals deepens the sense of inadequacy and reinforces the belief that any deviation from perfection is grounds for rejection. The shadow of expectations is also fueled by the human tendency to equate connection with performance. Instead of viewing relationships as spaces for mutual growth and support, they are often seen as arenas where individuals must prove their worth. This performance mindset turns vulnerability into a risk rather than a strength, as it is perceived as a potential flaw in one's presentation rather than an opportunity for genuine connection. The result is a defensive posture where people hesitate to engage fully, fearing that any perceived failure will result in rejection or judgment. The irony of these dynamics is that the very expectations that are meant to protect or prepare an individual for connection often prevent it entirely. By holding themselves and others to impossible standards, people inadvertently create the very isolation they fear. They deny themselves the opportunity to experience the imperfect but deeply fulfilling reality of authentic relationships where vulnerability, growth, and acceptance coexist. Unrealistic expectations, whether directed inward or outward, cast a long shadow, distorting how people approach connection and fostering a cycle of avoidance. Recognizing this shadow requires a willingness to confront and challenge these ingrained beliefs, to question whether the standards being upheld are realistic, fair, or even necessary. Only by doing so can individuals begin to dismantle the barriers that expectations create and move closer to the genuine connections they seek. The power of choice and agency lies at the heart of human experience, shaping the trajectory of relationships, aspirations, and personal growth. Regardless of the psychological complexities that influence behavior, fear, unconscious patterns, societal pressures, or unrealistic expectations, there remains a profound and undeniable truth: the ability to choose. In the realm of connection, this capacity to decide to act or not act becomes a defining moment, determining whether longing is transformed into fulfillment or left to fester as regret. Choice, at its core, represents freedom and responsibility. It is the recognition that no matter how heavy the weight of past experiences or current fears, an individual retains the power to take a step forward. This freedom is not without its challenges, as the barriers to action are often deeply ingrained and emotionally charged. However, it is precisely within this tension between desire and hesitation, between longing and action, that agency finds its most powerful expression. To act requires confronting the internal barriers that hold one back. It involves acknowledging fears of rejection, inadequacy, or vulnerability, and choosing to move forward despite them. This process is not about the absence of fear, but about the willingness to face it. In this sense, courage is not the opposite of fear. It is action in its presence. Every moment of hesitation, every internal debate is an opportunity to reclaim agency, to assert one's ability to shape their reality rather than be shaped by it. The act of choosing also necessitates a reevaluation of one's relationship with uncertainty. Human beings are wired to seek security and predictability, yet connection inherently involves risk. There is no guarantee of reciprocation, no certainty that one's efforts will lead to the desired outcome. However, it is precisely this uncertainty that makes connection meaningful. Without risk, there can be no reward. Without vulnerability, there can be no authenticity. The power of choice lies in the willingness to embrace this uncertainty, to step into the unknown with the faith that the act of reaching out holds value regardless of the outcome. Agency also involves recognizing the narratives that one tells oneself about their capacity for change. It is easy to feel trapped by patterns, to believe that avoidance or inaction is inevitable because this is just how I am. These stories can become self-fulfilling prophecies, reinforcing cycles of behavior that feel impossible to break. Yet the truth is that agency is not static. It is dynamic and ever-present. Every moment offers a new opportunity to make a different choice, to rewrite the narrative, and to reclaim control over one's actions. In relationships, the power of choice extends beyond the decision to act. It also encompasses how one acts. It is not merely about making the first move or reaching out, but about the authenticity and intention behind those actions. Choosing to approach connection with honesty, openness, and respect reflects a deeper level of agency. It shifts the focus from outcomes to values, from seeking validation to expressing one's truth. This approach not only increases the likelihood of meaningful connection, but also fosters a sense of self-respect and alignment with one's core principles. Despite the empowerment that choice and agency can bring, the act of deciding is often accompanied by the fear of failure or regret. What if the choice to act leads to rejection? What if the decision to remain silent results in a missed opportunity? These questions are natural, but they also highlight the paradox of agency. Inaction is itself a choice. To do nothing is to decide, and this decision carries its own consequences. The power of choice is not about guaranteeing success, but about embracing the responsibility for one's role in shaping their own life. Ultimately, agency is not about controlling every aspect of life or ensuring specific outcomes. It is about claiming ownership of the moments that matter, the moments where action can bridge the gap between longing and reality. It is about recognizing that despite the complexities of the mind and the unpredictability of the world, the decision to take a step, however small, is always within reach. It is in these choices that individuals find the potential for growth, connection, and the fulfillment of their deepest desires. In the end, the essence of connection lies not in guarantees, nor in perfection, but in the courage to show up, to risk, and to choose. It is in these moments where fear meets hope and action overcomes hesitation that we define not only our relationships, but ourselves. The path to fulfillment may be uncertain, but the choice to walk it is always ours to make. What will you choose?